Life of David Livingston, Part 23. Henry M. Stanley, the leader of the Herald expedition of search, is a native to the state of Missouri, where he spent his boyhood and youth. The system of popular education in Missouri was never successfully put into operation during the existence of slavery in the Commonwealth. Like most of the boys of that state, Stanley grew up having many more physical than intellectual exercises. He developed and strengthened sinew and muscle. However, he became accustomed to danger and was therefore all unconsciously to himself being educated for the great work of his life. His parents died when he was about 18 years old, leaving him a small estate but without a calling or profession by means of which to obtain a livelihood. This was during the late American Civil War. Though the income from his parents would have gone a good way towards his support, he felt that it was his duty to earn his substance by his own exertions, herein manifesting a spirit of independence which is a quite general characteristic of Western people. He had already shown a literary ambition. Some of his verses had appeared in rural journals, and though regretting the want of a regular course of mental training, he resolved that he would become a writer for the press. Looking about for a field in which he might distinguish himself, he sought employment as a war correspondent of the New York Herald. His chief recommendation at the time, says a great journal, was his energy and industry and fearlessness in collecting facts, not the style in which he told them. For although he had previously shown some indications of literary ability, his pen was as yet neither practiced nor fluent. His energy, industry, and fearlessness were doubtless better appreciated in the Herald office than by the general public, but his reputation as a writer grew with time, and he constantly performed his correspondential duties to the satisfaction of his experienced employers. Of an adventurous nature, he took a warm interest in the attempt of the Cretians in 1866 to throw off the Turkish yoke and establish their independence. With the object of joining the Cretan army, he sailed for Europe, first making arrangements for correspondence with the Herald. He was not pleased with the leaders of the revolution and declined to volunteer in the army of the famous little island. It appears that he had a sort of roving commission from the Herald, and now undertook a journey on foot with a few traveling companions of his own country, by which it was completed to pass through Asia Minor, the provinces of Russian Asia, the Khanates, Bukhara and Khiva, eastern Turkestan, and go through China to the coast. This project came, however, to a disastrous end. The little party had not penetrated more than about 100 miles from Smyrna when it was attacked by Turkish brigands, completely plundered, and compelled in consequence to return. Arriving at Constantinople in the most sorry plight, the members of the party were kindly received by the Han-e-Joy Morris and United States minister to the Turkish Sultan, and their wants supplied by a check upon the generous minister's private banker. An account on the affair, written by Mr. Stanley, had appeared in the public journal of the country, so that Mr. Morris had been appraised of the facts, afterwards fully substantiated in court justice before the travelers appeared in a shabby attire, attesting a needy situation. Inasmuch as one of Mr. Stanley's companions, No by name, afterwards brought a charge of cruel treatment against the Herald representative during this journey so disastrously terminated, it will be here to give the statement made by Mr. Morris. It is all the more in place here because it relates certain facts of Mr. Stanley's life and delineates certain prominent points of his character so faithfully that it may be regarded as almost strictly biographical. After the appearance of Mr. No's charge against Stanley, the Herald sent a reporter to Atlantic City, New Jersey, where Mr. Morris was temporarily residing, instructed to get such information from him as might feel disposed to communicate. An account of the interview was published in the Herald on September 7, 1872. The substantial portions follow. Quote, Mr. Morris, I first met Mr. Stanley, or at least heard of him, October 1866. I was then at my country residence in Bajukadere on the Bosphorus, and while there I received intelligence from Constantinople stating that three American travelers named Stanley, Noe, and Cook had been barbarously and cruelly treated and robbed of all their effects by a band of Turkish men in Asia Minor. In the advance of the arrival of the travelers at the Turkish capital, Stanley sent an account of the occurrence to the Levant Herald, a paper published in English in which the particulars of the attack were all fully narrated. I lost no time in taking the necessary steps. When the tidings reached me for the protection and relief of my countrymen when they should arrive. Meantime, the Turks, who were the perpetrators of the outrage, had been captured and conveyed, strongly guarded, to Borossa, a small town near the Sea of Marmora. And the reporter says, Did you see the Americans on their arrival? And then Mr. Morris says, I did. The American consul general and myself were both waiting to receive them when they arrived, and of course they immediately repaired to the embassy and when they got into the city. And then the reporter asks, What appearance did they present? Mr. Morris says, A most miserable appearance, sir. If ever the constitution of men presented the traces of cruel treatment, theirs did. Mr. Stanley's own plight might fully Stanley's own plight fully corroborated his story. He had been stripped of all his clothing, and though he had been enabled to procure some outside covering by the generosity of Mr. L.E. Palessa, agent of the Ottoman Bank at Al-Fund Karahisir, he had neither skirt nor stockings on when he came to see me, and he showed other evidences of great suffering. I relieved his more pressing necessities and advanced him a loan of money to procure an outfit for himself and his companions. I considered it to be my duty to do this, both as American minister and as American who was bound by the tie of nationality to stand by my countrymen in distress. I gave Mr. Stanley a check on my banker, and he drew the money, £150. The first thing he did was to repay the agent of the Ottoman Bank the amount advanced by him. And then he took his companions to a clothing bazaar, and both he and they procured the clothing of which they were so much in need. And the reporter asks, What security had you for your loan? Mr. Morris answers, I had no security, nor did I ask of any. The money was advanced without condition of any kind. I see it as it has been stated by no that the account was given in consequence of a draft which Stanley offered payable by person in New York. This is false. No draft was given to me at the time, nor was there any promise of a repayment made until subsequently. I advanced the money as a loan, asked for no security, nor was there any offered. Some time after, Mr. Stanley inconsiderately did give me a draft, but I looked upon this as altogether superfluous, and did not attach much value to the act. Though it may have been well meant, the draft proved valueless, but it's necessary to enter into details of a transaction which has so long satisfactorily settled between Mr. Stanley and myself, and which does not, as I said before, concern any persons outside of ourselves. I may state, however, that the action of Mr. Stanley was superfluous. In another way, as Mr. Cook, Stanley's fellow traveler, came to me after the money had been sent and assumed all responsibility connected to the loan, stating that if the money was not recovered from the Turkish government, he would personally indemnify me, giving me his American address. And then the reporter asks, "What impression did you form about Mr. Stanley at that time?" Mr. Morris answers, "I regarded him as a young man of great courage and determination. His countenance showed this, is it being stern almost to severity, but with nothing sinister about it." The reporter asked, "Did No at this time during the stay bring any charges of cruelty against Stanley?" And then Morris answers, "None that I can recollect of, though he was at perfect liberty to do so. As stated before, the Turkish outlaws were taken to Barossa, and after some time had elapsed, they were placed upon trial. As there was no American consul at the place, I obtained from Lord Lyons a promise that the British consul, Mr. Sanderson, should watch the trial and attend to the interests of my clients, Stanley, Cook, and No, who were at present as witnesses at Barossa. The Turks were placed upon trial and attempted to defend themselves, but the evidence against them was overpowering. Some of the effects of Stanley and his party were found upon their persons, including $300, which the party carried, and they were convicted and sentenced to various terms of imprisonment." And the reporter asks, "Did No swear to these facts?" Mr. Morris says he did, and his sworn statement will, if I mistake not, be found in the archives of the State Department. I never was more astonished in my life than I was when I heard that he now states that everything he related at Barossa was, while under oath, was entirely false. Reporter asks, "What steps did you institute to obtain restitution from the Turkish government?" Mr. Morris answers, "I had Stanley and the others draw up an inventory of the effects which had been lost, and they attested to the loss upon oath as being in every instance correct. I then forwarded the claim to the Turkish minister, including the money advanced by myself, which of course was included among the losses. The entire amount was, as near as I can recollect, was about $1,200, and the claim was prosecuted on our part with the greatest vigor and pertinency." The reporter asks, "Did Stanley and his friends remain in Constantinople after the trial?" And then Morris answers, "Not long. Stanley and No left for England, and Cook remained some time behind, settling affairs. Before separating, an agreement was entered into between them and me that if I recovered any money, it was to be sent to Cook, as I believe it was he that bore the expenses of the journey to Smyrna. Soon after Cook left, I urged the claim time after time upon the Turkish government, but did not meet with much success, and at length I was about to abandon the prosecution of the claim in despair when the Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Seferet Pasha, called upon me at my residence and offered to compromise the case by giving a smaller amount. I had some conversation with the Grand Vizier Ali Pasha about the same time, and I accepted the proposition in the amicable spirit in which it was offered. The money was paid, and I first took out of it £150, which I had lent. The balance of the money I sent to Cook." And the reporter asks, "Did any of the money go to Stanley?" Mr. Morris says, "Not a cent. I received a letter from No in which he desired to have a part, but as I did not wish to be dealing with too many parties, I sent the money, as I said, to Cook. But Stanley did not finger any of it, and No was treated with any injustice. And if No was treated with any injustice, Cook was the person he had got to look to, not to Stanley for me. This closed the transaction at the time, and I heard nothing more of the parties for some years." And the reporter asked, "When did you see Mr. Stanley again?" Mr. Morris says, "During the last year of my official residence in Turkey. In that year, a distinguished American clergyman called upon me at the embassy and asked me did I remember anything about the person named Stanley, and I answered in the affirmative, and he then stated that Mr. Stanley had desired him to call relative to a long-standing debt of £150, which he believed was owing to me, which had never been settled, and which he was desirous to pay. and I told the clergyman that the matter had been long settled and that I had been paid. The gentleman further stated that Mr. Stanley desired to call upon me, and I replied that he was at perfect liberty to do so. The same evening, Mr. Stanley and the clergyman called, and by invitation remained to dinner. We don't phrase things like that anymore. The clergyman called, and by invitation remained to dinner. The two gentlemen had come on from Egypt together, and the clergyman had an admiration which almost amounted to veneration for the character of the Herald correspondent. The reporter asked, "Was Mr. Stanley much changed in his appearance and manner?" And Mr. Morris says, "Wonderfully. The uncouth young man whom I first knew had grown into a perfect man of the world, possessing the appearance, the manners, and the attributes of a perfect gentleman. The story of the adventures which he had gone through and the dangers he had passed during his absence were perfectly marvelous, and he had become the lion of our little circle. Scarcely a day passed but he was a guest at my table, and no one was more welcome, for I insensibly grew to have strong admiration and felt an attachment for him myself. Instead of thinking he was a young man who had barely seen 26 summers, you would imagine that he was 35 or 40 years of age. Cultured and learned was he in all the ways of life. He possessed a thorough acquaintance with most of the Eastern countries, and as I took an interest in all that related to Oriental life, we had many a talk about what he had seen and what I longed to see. He stated that he stated to me that he had a sort of roving commission for the Herald, but that he had exhausted all known countries and was at a loss to understand where he should go next. And I said to him, "Stanley, what do you think of trying Persia? That is an unexplored country, and would well repay a visit if you could get back with your life." Stanley thought over the proposal and rapidly came to the conclusion he would go. I busied myself in procuring him letters of introduction to the Russian authorities in the Caucasus, in Georgia, and other countries through which he would have to pass. He saw the Russian ambassador at Constantinople in person, who was so well impressed with him that he made exertions to facilitate his progress to the mysterious home of the Grand Lama. I had some time previously to this had a Henry rifle sent to me from a friend in New York as a specimen of American art, and this I presented to Stanley. With my best wishes for the success of his undertaking, he started on the desperate enterprise some time after, and my table thereby lost one of its most entertaining guests. When I say desperate enterprise, I mean it, for Persia is to a European a practically unexplored country, and in consequence of its weak government, the marauders with which it abounds, a journey to Zanzibar or Unyanyembe would be a safe trip compared to it. How Stanley accomplished the task he undertook, the columns of the Herald will tell. I received a letter from him while he was on the way, narrating the hospitable manner in which he had been entertained by the Russian authorities, and the way in which he had astonished them by performances of the Henry rifle. His journey through the Caucasus and Georgia was a sort of triumphal march, though he was looked upon as a lost man by all who knew anything of the East. The route he took was an entirely new one, as he went in a kind of zigzag way to Thibet, and he must have in a charmed life to have come through so much peril so completely safely. After this affair, I returned home, and did not hear of Mr. Stanley again until I heard of him as the discoverer of Livingston. Then the reporter asks, "Were you astonished at hearing of the latter fact?" And then Mr. Morris says, "Not in the slightest. I would be astonished at no feat in the line of travel that he would accomplish. He is a born traveler. He has all the qualities which the great explorers possessed: Mungo Park, Humboldt, and Livingston himself. A hardy frame, unflinching courage, inflexible perseverance. If such a thing were possible, that I were forced to become a member of a band of under to become a member of a band to undertake some forlorn hope, some desperate enterprise, I know of no one whom I would so readily select as the leader of such an undertaking as Henry Stanley. I received his narrative of the discovery of Livingston with implicit faith, and from my knowledge of him and his character, I am lost in wonder that his story should be for an instant doubted. That he has found Livingston is, in my opinion, as great a certainty as that you are now in Atlantic City. The perils of a journey into the interior of Africa would have no terrors for him. A considerable portion of the year 1868 was spent a considerable portion of the year 1868 was spent. It's like something's missing because there's no period, but then the next thing starts a new paragraph. So it might be a printing error. A considerable portion of the year 1868 was spent. Mr. Stanley in Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia, where he accompanied the British expedition against King Theodore. He accompanied the English army as far as Magadala, and on several occasions was enabled to transmit accounts of the expedition, embracing most important news to the Herald, and in advance of intelligence sent to the British government. The people of America were thus supplied with intelligence of this singular British foray in northeastern Africa before the people of England, and it may well be suspected that they know more of the Anglo-Abyssinian War today than the people of England generally know. Mr. Stanley's remarkable success in Abyssinia were highly appreciated by the Herald, and the quest for Dr. Livingston being now fully determined on, there was no hesitation in placing him in charge of the expedition. Mr. Stanley is now about 29 years of age. He is a thick-set, powerful man, though short of stature, being only about 5'7" in height. He is a sure shot, an experienced swimmer, fine horseman, trained athlete. Few men living have more experience in roughing it and a better selection for the command of this singular undertaking the Herald could not possibly have made, and this the result of so astonishing to the world proves. And thus it was that the discoverer of the discoverer was prepared for his great work, which, as we saw, at the close of the preceding chapter, he had entered upon, strongly feeling with that while he should be in search of Livingston from east coast of Africa, the explorer would be on his journey out of the country by the way of the Nile. For he concludes his Zanzibar letter following of February 9, 1869, to which we have now referred as follows, quote, "Now the reader of this letter know really as much to the whereabouts of Dr. Livingston as I do, but probably from conversation heard from different persons I have greater reason for judging of the case, and I believe it will be a very long time yet before Dr. Livingston arrives, and that his return will be by the river Nile. With this opinion, but with a good stock of supplies for Livingston's journey down the Nile, should he be found proceeding in that way, and with the best escort attainable, Stanley in charge of the unique newspaper expedition, but not till after long delay, on account of wars, plunged into the wilderness, to be heard from no more until after many long months of suspense and conjecture."